I'm really glad. I'm so glad to be here. This is great. So I thought what I would do is just, I know you all, so how many of you read from the book? I know some of you read certain chapters, right? Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and the project to collect these diaries and how this all came about. And then I would like to talk a little bit about sort of framing and how I think about these diaries, and maybe if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about diaries versus memoirs, sort of the attributes of diaries versus memoirs, to try to think about sort of what you can glean from diaries and what their strengths and limitations are. And then we'll talk specifically about some of the diaries in the book. And hopefully you'll, at that point, be willing to share some of your thoughts and reflections, and we'll look together at some diary entries. As Gail said, my first, well, she didn't say this, but my connection to Daniel's story is that it was my first job out of college. I had my art history and French literature major, which was not a useful major in a certain way. I mean, it doesn't have a lot of practical application, but like all good majors, that was a way in which I learned how to do research and critical thinking, and how to read, and how to think about the historical record, and how to, most importantly, how to ask questions, how to even think that there were questions to be asked. So I was working at the Holocaust Museum as a researcher for Remember the Children Daniel's Story. This is what I was hired to do. And I was asked to have a look at diaries that had been kept by teenagers at the time, because as those of you who've seen the exhibition know, the storyline is told through the diary of this character, Daniel. And so we were going to write this diary. And in order to write the diary, which is the exhibition script, we needed to read real diaries and get a sense of how kids express themselves and what kinds of things they wrote about. So I went to the library and had a look at the published sources. There were 7 or 8 diaries that had been translated into English and published at the time. And I read them, and as those of you who have read from Salvaged Pages probably know, they are incredibly compelling. I mean, they just grab you. They're the sort of singularity of each voice, the different way in which writers express themselves, the depth of their thoughts and feelings, their ability to observe their lives, the sophistication of their language. All of these things were just astonishing to me. And I really felt, a sort of a number of things. One of the first things was a sense of just sort of wonderment that I had never encountered any of these diaries before, that I had only ever heard of the Diary of Anne Frank. It never even occurred to me that there was one single other young writer who wrote a diary, which, when you think about the numbers, when you think about millions of people in the Holocaust, it seems sort of strange to think that there would only be one. Of course, there must have been more than one, but yet Anne Frank's diary is the one that has grabbed hold. And, oh, you poor thing, are you okay? And then I got to be kind of curious about, well, are these diaries like Anne Frank's diary, or are they different from her diary? In what ways are there themes or threads that run through this body of material, or are they all completely different? How much does the content reflect the place that it was written, and how much does it reflect the time, and how much does it reflect other broader themes that might be echoed across the texts? These are the kinds of questions that I was able to ask because, these are the kinds of questions I was able to conceptualize and to ask because of the education that I had had. And then my last question was, are there more diaries like this out there? Is this it, or are there more? So I started to look for diaries and started to think about whether I could gather them and where I could find them, and that is what sort of launched this project. What I was really contending with when I started this work was that, any thoughts that anybody had about young writers' Holocaust diaries were defined by the Diary of Anne Frank, obviously, right? So how was her diary presented? In the 1950s, when her diary was published, the gentleman who wrote the review in the New York Times wrote that Anne Frank essentially that Anne Frank's sort of inner soul and inner spirit was contained in her diary, because her diary was so personal and so intimate that she poured everything of herself into it, and that the survival of the diary was like the survival of Anne Frank herself, that it almost kind of undid the death of Anne Frank because she lives on through her diary. And I'm sure those are words that you have heard before. Then, on a slightly larger scale, Anne Frank's eloquence, her ability to write, her sense of humor, her sort of unusual voice spoke for all of the young people who perished during the Holocaust. That was sort of the second phase. So she survived through her diary. She, in some symbolic way, rescued all of the other writers from oblivion by the eloquence of her voice. And finally, that her hopeful spirit, her optimism, her belief in the humanity the goodness of human beings, this famous line that you all know, I'm sure, I still believe that human beings are good at heart, redeemed all of us for the evil that took place during the Holocaust, right? That if Anne Frank could express her faith in humanity and her belief and her hope and her optimism, then, then who are we to argue with her? That she must, in her wisdom, know or see or understand something greater than what we are able to see for ourselves. So this was the way that her diary was framed. And I felt at the time, and still to this day, that this was a very artificial and sort of self-serving way of thinking about these diaries, because it's really a way of saying it's not that bad. Anne Frank died, but she lives on. Millions of children died, but there are voices to speak for them. The Holocaust was terrible, but the survival of these diaries shows us the resilience and the triumph of the human spirit. And to me, I felt like the second half of all of those sentences negates the first half of the sentence. Really, the more true thing to say is Anne Frank was murdered, full stop. Just millions of young people were murdered, stop. And the Holocaust was terrible, reflects the evil and depravity of human beings, stop. I didn't want that sort of positive light to be shed on it. So when I faced the challenge of gathering these diaries and collecting them and having them translated and then framing them, I knew that if I just published them without taking apart the frame of Anne Frank's diary, that was going to be the language that would be applied to them, because that's always how it's been. But then the question became, what is an appropriate frame? If you're going to dismantle a paradigm, if you're going to say, this is not the right way to think about it, these diaries don't constitute the survival of the writers or the capturing of an entire generation or the redemption of the human spirit, then what do they stand for? And ultimately, the way that I chose to think about it was as, sort of restoring the significance of these as historical and literary records, something that young people are often not recognized for, right? These diaries were viewed as symbols of lost lives, not as actual documents that you would mine for information or mine for insight, and that you would read them to genuinely deepen your understanding about the Holocaust. So that was sort of the shift that I wanted to make in this, in this book. So are there any questions at this point about what I've said so far? And I will repeat the questions if there are, but does anyone have any observations or thoughts or questions? The decision about which diaries to use was very difficult, because by the time I was ready to compile this book and do the research and write, I had found, far more material than I could ever use. There were more than 60 diaries that I knew about. And they were in all stages of accessibility, meaning that you could have a diary that was 5 volumes long and hundreds of pages that you would only be able to pull maybe a short amount from. And then you could have a diary that was very fragmentary, just a few pages that would need an enormous amount of scaffolding in order to get at whatever was inside it. And then there were the diaries that were somewhere in the middle, you know, the ones that were rich enough and interesting enough and that shed light either on the history or on the literary side of things, that could stand alone enough that sort of the type of scaffolding that I was doing in the form of the introduction would be enough, but not so much that taking an excerpt was going to be to completely, you know, that it would be impossible to reflect the entirety. So there was this sort of sweet spot in the middle. And there were other diaries that I could have chosen. I mean, there were some that I was absolutely sure about, and there were some that were on the fence for a long time. And then the other thing was the desire to try to create not a whole record, but to really broaden, to make sure that there were diaries from a huge range of experiences. So refugee diaries, for example, diaries of young people in hiding and passing, diaries of young people in ghettos, writers who were wealthy and writers who were poor and in the middle, rural areas and urban areas and in the middle. You know, young people from big families and small families, young people from Orthodox Jewish families, communities, through to secular Jews, to children of mixed marriages, to one who was converted to Catholicism. So that across any category, you'd have a spectrum of experiences. Really, really, really great, amazing, incredible lyrical writers to ones who were not so much that way. So that was sort of the kind of wanting to, and also, of course, needless to say, location in terms of the nations that were represented and languages that were represented. In terms of the order of the diaries in the book, I had this kind of, I was plagued by this recurring worry that any kind of grouping would be, it would seem like I was trying to create something whole out of fragments. And what I really wanted to do with this book was keep the fragmentary feel of the material. So like, for example, to put 3 diaries from a similar ghetto together would be sort of representative of that place. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep those things separate because I felt like, you know, I didn't want to lull the reader into this feeling like, oh, now I've read about, like these diaries stand for Lodge Ghetto, and now I've read about Lodge Ghetto and I'm done. So I did it in a more organic way. I mean, I really thought as a writer more than anything else, and sort of as what was the arc of the experience I wanted the reader to have, and what were the transitions from diary to diary. And the fact is that I can't even really tell you what I was doing because that was turned out to be far more of a creative and artistic kind of effort than much of the rest of the work, which was certainly, you know, there was sort of historical grounding and everything. But this was more like, how do I want it to feel when you read it? How do I want you to move from text to text and have there be echoes and relationships, but not have it be too literal? Yeah. This is something I've thought a lot about. And so this book took me 10 years, and it took the entire decade of my 20s. So I first had the idea in my early 20s, and I published the book shortly before I turned 30, or maybe I was 30. And I went through a lot of, I would say, significant sort of, to use a hackneyed phrase, kind of journey. Because in the beginning, a lot of my motivation for this book was this deeply emotional sense that these writings were being ignored and that they should be made public. And the stories are these writers are so compelling, and they very quickly became very real to me. And yet I felt all the time like I needed to resist the temptation to sort of romanticize them into wholeness, because that was kind of contrary to my whole point of what I was trying to do. And then there was a time in the work when I got engulfed by it, which does, I think, happen. I don't know about for any of you, but when you study the Holocaust, you know, you can find at a certain point that there's no bottom. You know, you sort of are going down and down and down, and you're encountering all this terrible history and this difficult material and cruelty and depravity, and you think, there's got to be a bottom to this. There's got to be a point at which I've heard the worst thing I could possibly hear, and that's it. And then there was no bottom. Like, it just, there kept being more stories. And I would definitely say that I lost my bearings for a while. And I was not able to have the kind of objectivity that was needed for this work. And then gradually, I sort of found what I think of as a kind of, it's like a rapprochement, like that kind of military, like this or détente. It's like this kind of stasis where you're far enough away that you can be objective, but you're close enough that you can have feeling and compassion. And you have to sort of find that place. And for me, finding that place took a long time. But once I found it, I knew that I was there and that I had the right voice. And I will say the same thing had to happen for my second book. It was a different process, and it was a different, my relationship to the subject matter was much closer in the second book. But this book, I wanted it to be formal. I wanted it to be filled with, I wanted the compassion to come through, but I wanted it to be formal, and I wanted it to be serious. I didn't want it to be sentimental and romantic. I didn't want people to be able to disregard it and say, like, oh, this is just, you know, these are just the, you know, sad little children's stories. I really wanted to say, no, these are serious records, and they really matter. And you can learn things about the Holocaust from these diaries that you cannot learn from anywhere else, not any single adult diary. There are things that are contained here that will complicate and provoke in ways that are really meaningful. So ultimately, you know, it was just, that's part of the process, I think, for the writer, is to find your relationship to the subject matter. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. I have a lot of anecdotal evidence about this. I've never studied it, but certainly a great many of the diaries that I found and the diaries that are in Salvaged Pages were salvaged by people who were doing it for very clear reasons, you know, realizing that these were primary sources and personal accounts that would have meaning and value. Some of the diaries, like there was a diary that I worked on another, this is a separate book, but it was a diary written by a young girl named Rivka Lipschitz who lived in Lodz Ghetto. That diary was found in Birkenau by a Russian doctor and was saved. Another diary, the Diary of the Anonymous Boy, which some of you read, was found by a Pole in an abandoned apartment building, and he kept it for 25 years before he gave it to Yad Vashem. So, I don't know what Yad Vashem is. I'm sorry, Yad Vashem is the Holocaust Memorial in Israel, and a Memorial Archive and Museum in Israel, in Jerusalem. So yes, I think the answer to the question is yes, and I think that the diaries themselves reflect also a growing sense on the part of these writers that keeping a record was important for posterity. And that actually makes me want to read an entry that is giving me an in to one of the diary entries from Alice Ehrman, which is the very last diary in the book. So this is an entry written on November 1st, 1944. Alice Ehrman was the child of the second daughter of a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman. She was 17 years old. She had been in Theresienstadt, in the ghetto about 35 kilometers outside of Prague, for several years at this point. And she was in love with a young man named Zev Shek, who had been involved in the administration, the Jewish administration of the ghetto. And Zev and Alice and a number of other people undertook a project to collect documents inside the ghetto and records and hide them so that they would be able to have them after the war. In this diary entry, this is now sort of the fall before the spring when the liberation happened. The tide of the war has shifted. It is totally clear that the war is going to end and the Allies are going to be victorious, but it is not clear when it is going to happen. And she's writing, as you'll hear from her diary, from a place of total exhaustion and resignation, that whatever happens, happens. We've been through so much, we have no more strength, we're finished. So in this entry, she's describing the urn chamber. That's the first part. And what she's referring to there is the disposal of the remains of people who died in the ghetto, not people who were put in gas chambers or cremated in ovens like you learn about in Auschwitz-Birkenau and other death centers, but rather people who died of illness or malnutrition or any number of other causes and who were cremated. And for reasons that defy understanding, the Germans kept these ashes in these cardboard boxes. And so now the Allies are coming right from the West. The Americans are coming from the West. The Russians are coming from the East in this pincer movement. And the time is coming when the Allies are going to flood into this camp. And so the Germans say, we have to dispose of these remains so that the death of all these people is not known. And they require the Jews in the ghetto to dump these ashes into the river. So that is what precipitates the writing of this entry. So I'm on page 405. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to read a little bit of it. November 1st, 1944. The urn chamber is being cleared. 30,000 urns, 30,000 cardboard boxes, 30,000 remains of people, mothers, children, loved ones. What is the point? More importantly, it is the knowledge that dead witnesses, substance is being destroyed, and we are the witnesses, we who still live, I and you, my sister, and all those who are gone. It is not a technical problem, but I cannot imagine it, and still I am afraid to admit that I have understood it. And still I go to work in the morning, will eat, sleep, wash my hands, brush my teeth, maybe even laugh. I will not think about it, but it will inform all my thoughts. Perhaps everything will grow quiet, and it will retreat into the background, and I will be permitted to not think once again. Or will it grow huge so that all my thoughts end in it, even my life and my time, until I myself come to an end in it? Oh, my mother and you, am I afraid? I will read Faust and Isaiah and Jeremiah, and I will try to bear written witness as best I can so that it will survive me. That is what occupies my thoughts. Not to have the world take notice of me. Not to say there was one who was beautiful and smart and open to the world, and she was 17 and was snuffed out before her life could even start. No. To say to the world in time what was accomplished here. To read to them a chapter out of the Gola, dated 1944. So, can we have some responses? Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, too, one of the things about diaries that is so interesting, and this sort of connects with what you're saying, is that it's in the specificity of things that, the details, that you can have an insight like that. So one of the things about memoirs, even though memoirs can be incredibly valuable and useful because unlike a diary, there's perspective, there's knowledge, for example, that the writer might not have. But one of the things that often gets lost in this sort of broad brush is just that kind of little detail that the writer isn't necessarily even focusing on. That was the number of people. And so she said that was the number of people. And she certainly lingers over it in a kind of horrified amazement that it could be so many people. But for us, that little piece of information can lead to an insight like this, or just the sense that, like, these are the numbers we're talking about. And one of the things that's so powerful about this is that in the context of the Holocaust, 30,000 isn't even that many. It's a huge number of people, And yet, we become accustomed to hearing, millions, 50,000, 100,000, 500,000, 1 million, 2 million, and the numbers at a certain point stop having any meaning. We don't even know how to comprehend them. So I think that's great. That's the kind of thing that I love about diaries, is that one little one little phrase like that can lead to these other kinds of reflections. You know, one of the things that I did in the course of the work was to keep track of the times that writers mentioned other writers' diaries. Because very often the writers will say, so-and-so is keeping a diary. Like my friend is keeping a diary, or another friend is keeping a diary, or I encourage people to, at least 4 or 5 diaries have references in them to other diaries, multiple. And you just begin to get a sense of, you know, those are all lost. Like I didn't find any of those diaries, you know, so how many perspectives were there or would there have been? And, you know, and again, just the other thing about it for me was just the sense of like, how common was this exactly? You know, among people who were able to write, who were in a place where they could write, you know, I think a lot of young people, I don't know what a lot is, but I mean, if you just take this book as an example, I think that people understood the necessity, and this goes back to your point, of making a record when they could. Even people who weren't really much in the way of writers did it, because there was this need to testify to this extraordinary moment that they were living through. Yeah. It's her hand. I wanted to see if I could find that. Oh my gosh, that's awesome. Which one? Can you read it? Oh, yeah. Yes. This one of, yeah. There is a bonfire in the courtyard of the Sudeten barracks. Sweating SS men are throwing 10 to 20 kilogram packages of files down from the windows. They stand there in a line, like the Jews a year ago, and sweat it out. Above, they patrol and collect stray pages blowing about. And this is now April 17th of 1945. So she also begins that entry by writing, all of a sudden we feel so secure and guarded and protected by a world that knows about us. So there's this sense that, you know, it's really over, and the world is, you know, knows, and they can't simply be slaughtered now because it's known what is happening or what has been happening. One thing I have to say about this is so important for a project like this is that one way of saying this is that in a book like this, there are always 3 hands at work, right? There's the hand of the writer, there's the hand of the translator, and there's the hand of the editor. So the text is mediated by in these ways, in these layers, right? So I was very aware that when I was reading the diaries, I was reading, for the most part, reading a translation, and I tried to be careful to bear that in mind in terms of the sort of whether the diary had been translated and sort of its literary value inflated, or to the contrary, of a not very strong translator, perhaps some of its value was lost. I think my main concern was about range of experiences, but I was also very aware, and this was true for Peter Feigl, it was true for David Rabinowitz, and it was true for Elza Binder in particular, I remember, that these were young people who had really amazing ideas, and some of them, sophisticated, complicated ideas, but they didn't have the language and the education to get them out. And so there's always this thing of like, what is language? You know, language is our gateway. That's our communication. That's how we relate. But you can think about what it's like to be speaking a foreign language. You can have the most amazing ideas in the world, but if you don't have the skills in the language, then you can't communicate them. So it doesn't, and there's always this problem of thinking that people who don't have the language are dumb because they must not have the ideas, which is obviously not true. So one of the things that I did want to do in this book, and I did it by including these diaries, was to include writers who I felt that their work had something to contribute and their work mattered and shed light in some way, even if the quality of their use of language was not as high as another writer. And it's interesting because the diary of Rivka Lipschitz, this girl that I just mentioned, is another example of this. My translator, Polish translator who translated her diary, said, you know, her grammar is terrible. I mean, her actual ability to, you know, her knowledge of the language is poor, but her ideas and what she was grappling with was so sophisticated. And as a translator, it poses some really difficult problems, because how do you translate? So I didn't have children at the time that I did this work. I have 2 children now, who are 11 and 8. And I often say, I think I was saying it earlier today, I'm not sure I could have done this book the way that I did it if I had had children at the time. You know, because there's a way in which, and I hope you'll take this in the right way, because presumably most of you don't have children, I didn't have skin in the game. Like, I didn't see my children's faces in front of me when I was doing the work. I think if I had, and I do more now, it's almost unbearable. You know, and it makes you, as a writer, it makes you so vulnerable in a way that is not helpful. However, there were diaries that I'll give you just an example. The diaries of Eva Gins and Peter Ginzova, which were a brother and sister who wrote in Theresienstadt. They were very close. She adored her brother. He was an incredibly gifted artist and writer and poet, and he was just amazing, and thinker and scholar, and he was deported to Auschwitz and was murdered. And I have 2 brothers who I adore, and I have a twin brother in particular who is my twin. And so that was a diary certainly that was hard for me not to relate to her and the loss of her brother, and not sort of see the vulnerability of, or sort of imagine what would it feel like to me if it was my twin brother who was being, you know, ripped away from me. But in the end, I think the diaries that I felt the most attached to were the ones that had the writing that I loved the most. And there are many. But there is one diary, the diary of Yitzhak Rudyshevsky, who was a young writer. And maybe because he was a young writer, you know, maybe because of how he handled the written word and sort of his mission in life to use language to express the complexity of his experiences, I think that one was one that has always been and remains, you know, very, very, very dear to me and very personal. Not so much because I can imagine him as my son or my brother or a cousin, but because I sort of understand him. You know, what he wanted to do with his life is what I get to do with my life. Well, I did follow up all the writers who survived. I was in touch with all the writers who survived. And I was in touch with the immediate families of many of those who didn't, wherever it was possible. So, and that was incredibly important, again, because the records are fragmentary. In order to get the information that is needed to contextualize them, you know, there's a lot that you can do with the historical record. But there are certain things that you'll never know. Who was Aunt Katie? Who's going to know who Aunt Katie was? Only the writer or the family. And maybe you can live without knowing who Aunt Katie was, or maybe you can't. But those were threads that had to be pursued. So for sure, for Klaus Langer, for Elizabeth Koenig, and for Peter Feigl, I was in touch with them. And Peter Feigel's still alive and well and is a dear friend of mine, and he's the third diary. He calls me and says, "Hi, Alexandra, this is chapter 3 calling." And then others like Otto Wolff wrote in hiding. He perished, his sister survived. And so I went down to Florida and interviewed her. So I did try to follow up. I mean, do I wish there was more? Yes. I, of course, always wish that there was more. But, you know, there were strange things that happened. You know, it turned out that over the years and now the decades, because it's been so long since I started doing this research, that other things began to surface. You know, there are artworks that these young writers made. I was working in the Holocaust Museum, and I came upon in the photo archives a new photo of Yitzhak Rudashevsky that was just there, that had been donated by a cousin who had survived, and no one, I mean, it was there, but nobody cared that it was there, because who cared? But I nearly, you know, flipped my lid, because here was this new perspective on this writer. And I always think about that. There's an entry in which he says, he writes that there have been a new quarter added to the ghetto, and that he walks around in the new quarter, and that he feels for a moment like a prisoner who's been released from his cell, but then realizes that it's just the same, it's a little bigger, but it's still a cell. And when I found this photo, I remember so vividly thinking, that's what this is like. It's like getting a little more, and it feels like this amazing discovery, but it's still always in the context of fragments. It's always in the context of never being able to have the whole picture of who he was. There were no diaries that I didn't include because they were anonymous. There were other anonymous diaries that I did not include, but that was because I didn't, for the same reasons that I didn't include other diaries. Those two diaries are so powerful and so important and so significant in so many ways that it never occurred to me not to publish them because they were anonymous. I mean, the fact I saw the original, I've seen the original diary of the anonymous boy, and I've seen so the original the girl's original diary, I think, has been lost, but there is a typescript. And they were authenticated in a way that I felt was good enough. But it's funny, it never occurred to me. I mean, I think the kinds of dilemmas that did bother me were more about privacy and about whether it was right to, in the case of writers who perished, was it right to publish on their behalf when it was not possible to ask someone? And I think people can come down in very different ways on that. I mean, at the end of the day, I felt that the demands of the historical record justified that chance. But I would be lying if I said that it didn't keep me up at night sometimes, in the past at least, that I felt, worried. But I think I felt that, these records, they just matter too much. The historical need for them outweighed what would be my own sort of sentimental idea of what the writer would or wouldn't want, if that makes sense. Which incidentally is the exact same set of questions that I ended up having to ask myself about writing a book about my grandfather. Would my grandfather's desire for privacy, would my father's distaste for this subject matter, should those things weigh, how do those weigh or compare to my own need to document this history and create a public record? And how do you reconcile the possibility of betraying someone else's values or their ideas when you don't know what they are against your own need to do something in the present? It's a difficult question. None of the diaries in Salvaged Pages were censored. I wouldn't have been able to tolerate, I wouldn't have been able to handle it. I couldn't have accepted a diary that if I felt that, the decision of what to include was not up to me. But just because, for the obvious reason that, in order to be an authority on it, I needed to know that something wasn't being held back that I would need to see. There was one writer in particular, one woman who was a survivor, who wrote her diary in Riga, in Latvia, in the Riga ghetto, and I was desperate to get my hands on it. I wanted it so badly. And she just kept saying no. She had written her own dissertation on the subject, and she hadn't quoted from the diary. And she just refused to let me use it. And I've never read it, and I have no idea what's in it. And it was, really disappointing. But she just said no, and I had to respect that. And then there were diarists, there were quite a number of cases in which writers were in the process of publishing their own diaries. So those were, no matter how great the diary was, there was I had this feeling that, well, that's going to come out in another, in another avenue. So even if they said no, it was okay because they were going to still see the light of day. But for the most part, I didn't run into that very much. Most people turned their diaries over and didn't ask a lot of questions about it. And part of it, I think, is because I think a lot of these writers didn't understand how important their records were. I think they thought, these were kind of insignificant childhood scribblings, and what difference did they make? And it wasn't until they saw them all together that they had a kind of different sense of, or until somebody pulled out the bits and pieces and said, well, this is how this relates to that, and this is the insight that's contained here that you didn't even know, you didn't even mean to do it, but you said it, and it's interesting and insightful, that they understood. Fortunately, no. But there were a lot of new diaries that surfaced in those years. There were probably at least 15 new diaries that came to light in the years between when Salvaged Pages was first published and when the second edition came out. So I did the end of the book, there's an appendix at the end of the book that has a sort of paragraph description of every diary that I knew of. And I added to that for the second edition so that the new diaries that I knew of would be represented. Yes and no. I mean, in some more and some less. Like, for example, Peter Feigl, I would say no. When he wrote his diary, he was a very vulnerable little boy. And he was really traumatized by what had happened to him and the loss of his parents. And he is someone who now is very together, very optimistic, very energetic, very full of life. You don't see the cracks very much at all in him. Every now and then it comes through, but you don't, even when it does, you don't see that little boy. But Elizabeth Kaufman, who was the second diarist in the book, she was the librarian at the Holocaust Museum, and I knew her for a long time. And she was exactly the same. She was mischievous. She was like a little sprite. She was always like appearing at weird times. She was like she had a very quirky sense of humor, which comes through. She writes this hilarious entry in the diary about how she and her mother in France were picked up as spies, German spies. So they're Austrian Jews in France fleeing, and they're picked up as suspected as German spies. And, it's not that funny to get picked up by the German police, in 1940 in France. But the way she tells the story is how stupid the police were. Like what a ridiculous, and how like she's sort of saucy and kind of snappy and backtalky and everything. She was like that for her whole life. I mean, she was always like that. And in the diary, she's a total snob about how much better Austria is than anywhere else. And she remained completely like that, all the time I knew her. So it's a great question. I mean, there are sometimes shades of these people. But your question also makes me think of something else, which I think is important to say, and that is that it's easy to forget in the focus on the texts the fact of adolescence and the fact that these were writers who were not only writing in turbulent, changing times in the world, but they were going through their own turbulent, changing times. Like adolescence is not negotiable. You don't put it on hold just because it's the Holocaust. It's happening developmentally no matter what, no matter where you are. And I think when you look for it, you see it here. You see it in the complexity of the relationships with parents and siblings. You see it in questions about the future and what these young writers wanted to be when the war was over. You see it in their questions about God and faith and love. There's a little bit of romance, occasional, there's one diary in particular where there's sort of a little love affair that goes on. But also in the deeper question about identity. Adolescence is about finding your identity. Who am I relative to my family, to my parents, to my siblings, to my nationality, to my culture, to my background. Who am I relative to all the things that I've inherited? What am I going to take and adopt, and what am I going to reject? And so the sort of challenge for these writers was to go through that process of changing identity while being persecuted for a central aspect of their identity. And in some cases, in every case actually, having their whole lives be thrown into turmoil as a result of that identity. So hiding is the most interesting in a way, because what does it mean to come of age and grapple with who you are at a time when you need to hide who you are, or pretend to be someone else in the case of writers who are passing, or flee because you've been rejected from your home country no longer wants you and you are running for your life. So all of that layering, I think, is really, really, really important. And it's there. It's not, in a lot of these cases, it requires digging, but it's definitely there. I'm glad you raised that. So it gave me an opportunity to reflect on that, because sometimes it gets lost in the shuffle. They were liberators in the sense that the Jews who were living under Nazi persecution were liberated from that oppression. But I mean, it is a complicated question, and I think there are many people who lived that history who would say they then replaced that oppressive system with another oppressive system, which was communism. How many of you have thought to yourselves, why didn't they just leave?
Several of you wrote more than several. Yes, absolutely.
So Klaus, this is there are a lot of things to say about this question. One of the things that is important about Klaus's diary is that it asks this question and it answers the question for us, in that if you read his diary carefully, you come to see that he had a very deep sense of his own entitlement as a German Jew, right? So just as American citizens, we do not think that we are in any imminent danger of being rounded up and deported because we have our citizenship. That was exactly their situation. They were German citizens. Klaus's father was a judge. You know, they had non-Jewish friends. They were completely integrated in German society. So the fact that they believed in those entitlements and believed in their place in society is not so surprising if you think of your own self and what it feels like to believe that, you know, that is what is conferred upon you with citizenship, right? And in terms of why didn't they see the writing on the wall, I mean, part of the challenge here is that the final solution, so-called final solution, hadn't been conceived of in 1938 when Klaus was writing. There were restrictions against Jews, things were happening, but not only had the actual genocide of these Jews not been conceived of, such a genocide on this scale had never been conceived of. So who would Klaus have had to be able to even conceive that such a thing could happen? It's simply not, it was out of the universe of possibility. Yes? I think most of the writers came to see the importance of their work for those who survived when the book came out. The relatives of people who perished always saw the importance of their loved ones' diaries, but for very personal reasons. I think it was the putting together of the texts and framing them in a particular way. A lot of writers, the survivors, said to me, you know, my diary's not like Anne Frank's diary. You know, her diary, she was such an amazing writer, and she, you know, and the reality is that the significance, their diaries are exactly like Anne Frank's diary in the way that, in the sense of sharing a genre, and they're totally different from Anne Frank's diary in the way that every diary is different from every other diary. But they didn't think that their diaries were like hers, like she was special. And I think that's why a lot of writers sat on their diaries for so long and never did anything with them, because they thought, well, the good one has already been published. My diary is not significant. And so many of these writers said to me, I don't know why you're interested in this. You know, I don't know why you're interested in this. This is nothing. These are just the scribblings. These are just my stupid high school, you know, this is just what I write. I didn't know anything. And I think, right, but until you see it in its context, until you mine it, you know, you don't realize how much is there. There's so much there in these texts. It's amazing. Back in 2005, we did a documentary film based on Salvaged Pages that aired on MTV. It was I spoke about this a little bit earlier. It was kind of a risky proposition for me because, you know, we wanted to make something that would be accessible for young audiences. This book is not in this particular form particularly accessible for young audiences, although it is made more accessible by teachers and by great educational materials that produced by Facing History and others. But we wanted to create something that would bring the material into the lives of young teens. And so I was approached by a director at MTV about doing a documentary based on the film, and we did. It's called I'm Still Here. And it was very, very interesting. I mean, this is a person who had been doing programming for this audience for a long time. She knew how to pace it and what kind of music to use and all kinds of things that sort of drew young audiences in, and almost like, it's sort of like the, what's that expression, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. You know, like the sort of framing the material in such a way that was palatable to a young audience so that they learned about something that they might otherwise have rejected. I mean, I've had an incredible time here. Yesterday I was speaking about 26 Seconds with Wendell White, and I was able to meet a lot of the faculty and a number of students, and I think you have a really special place here. I think this is a really special place. I have to say I'm incredibly impressed by the quality and the caliber of your questions and your observations and your attention and your focus. It's really remarkable. I mean, I have been in a lot of classes where I have not felt that I'm, you know, really engaging in the way that I want to with the subject matter with students. So it's incredibly gratifying, and I appreciate your slogging through the reading and coming and talking, because it's great. It's great to see that it's sparking questions and dialogue. So thank you for that.